I am absolutely delighted to start the first panel here, and I was, as Ali was taking us through the broad picture of our region and thinking about the city in the regional context, I got very excited. And if there's students here, please take my Understanding Metropolitan Regions class in the spring. We have a lot of people here that will be familiar to this audience, and so I would take half my time to introduce them properly for the number of accomplishments that these gentlemen have bestowed upon us. We're going to work this way, that way, but I would like to start by introducing a figure that will be very familiar to everyone in this room. It's just very quickly served multiple terms on the King County Commission, and then was elected, of course, I think re-elected three times to as county executive of King County, and then was appointed by President Obama as the Deputy Director of Housing and Urban Development. So Ron Sims brings multiple perspectives of scale to understanding how regions work and can work better, and we're looking forward to his thoughts on those, particularly in Tacoma and the South Sound, in that context that Ali Medeiros just sketched. Next to him, we have Cary Bozeman, who has unusually been the mayor of two very different communities at two very different times. This is very interesting, so we'll be able to speak to the question, I think, of leadership from the mayoral office of Bellevue in the 70s, is that correct? And the 80s, and the 90s, and as well as serving mayor in the mayor's office in Bremerton. So that will be very interesting to hear his perspectives in the different parts of the regions at different times. Of course, we have a familiar figure to all of us in this room, the Deputy Mayor of Tacoma and local architect David Bowe, who will be in a way coming right off of some of the themes that are introduced by our final speaker in this session, providing context and a wider lens for us to think about the challenges that Ali set out in jobs and housing. And that is Professor Ethan Seltzer. He is very, very well known in the urban studies world, particularly for his work on regional planning, and will be giving us thoughts on the Portland metropolitan context, as well as, I believe, some ideas around Cascadia as a region that is attractive to a lot of folks. So they're going to have we're going to start this way and move that way and end with you, Mr. Sims, and we're going to try to limit them to 15 minutes. Right, 15. We will, and that way we'll have a good half an hour at least for questions. Before I turn the floor over to Ethan, though, I am reminded of one thing. A very old, wise woman told me that when two people are in agreement about everything, one of them isn't necessary. Right. So I hope that these are tough issues and people disagree about them and the strategies, and that not necessarily I'm looking for disagreement within the panel, although we might have some. That's always good in a university environment, but across the day. And I would encourage all of us to welcome those diversity of views, and maybe someone says something that makes you think about something you didn't think about in the same way. These are people, very diverse experiences, very different disciplines, very different regional contexts, and different historical and professional experiences. So we are enormously excited to have them. So let me turn the floor over to you.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. This is great. I'm really glad to be here in Tacoma and to have a chance to share a few things with you. You know, before I start with my slides, I just want to kind of make one kind of global overall point, and that is that story of, you know, bike parking and naked bike rides and all the rest, is that things can change. You know, because there was a time in Portland's contemporary history when it wasn't that swell a place. You know, when the Willamette River was a biological desert, when we were losing population and jobs, when a lot of the statistics that Ali was showing us a few minutes ago could have been from Portland, could have been from where we're from. So, you know, the point in talking about what I'm going to talk about is not so much to say that there's a recipe here or anything else, as much as to say, always remember things can change. And the people in this room can change them. So that's kind of where I want to start. But let's talk a little bit about Portland. There's a couple different ways of kind of looking at Portland and kind of where I'm coming from, and some of these are definitely shared characteristics with Tacoma. The first is this is a really ancient place. There's a record of human habitation in the Portland region that goes back over 12,000 years. And I love saying that when I make presentations on the East Coast, you know, because presumably history started with the Pilgrims and Christopher Columbus, right? But you know, as we know, here in the West, we can tell the history of this place in a variety of different kinds of ways. And so you have to ask yourself, wow, 12,000 years, that's kind of a long time. You know, why did people hang around in the Portland region for 12,000 years or in the Tacoma region for 12,000 years? And the answer is that this is a great place to live. This is an abundant landscape. This place offers a lot of things that people need to survive and to thrive in a lot of ways. And the thing that's kind of interesting is that these places still do. But I think it's really important to remember that Portland, this place, these are stories that have been playing out over millennia. And for good reason. Second is we're at the edge of things. Now this is one of my favorite slides because really no one in the world knows where Portland is. You know, it's like you go someplace and you say I'm from Portland, Oregon, and they kind of give you that look like, you know, you just shot their dog, you know, and and you say well, you know, we're between Seattle and San Francisco. Oh yeah, fine, no problem, sounds great. You know, it's kind of like yeah, that's right. Glad you're here. You know? But we're at the edge, and one of the great things about not being in the center of things is that there's a lot of research that's been done on innovation. And it turns out that innovation is actually kind of a little easier to do at the edge because you're not weighed down with the expectations that go with being in the center of things, whether those expectations are attached to institutions or to you know, kind of ways of relating to each other or any other number of things. And so one of the really important parts of the Portland story is that, you know, up until about 1900, our booster vision was that we were going to be the biggest city on the West Coast. And actually, the booster vision in about 1900 was that Portland itself would be a city of 4 million people. You know, I mean, these people, in fact, I've got this great image, which I don't have with me today, of, you know, essentially the battery of Manhattan superimposed on the intersection of the Willamette and Columbia Rivers, you know, because Portland was going to be the Manhattan, you know, of the West Coast. And up until 1900, that wasn't so crazy. If you remember the slide that Ellie had here just a minute ago that showed increase in population, in Seattle, I mean, Seattle was actually smaller than Portland up until about 1900. And then all of a sudden, Seattle, San Francisco, even LA just exploded. And Portland, you know, was kind of left in the dust, kind of going, what the heck? But we've been kind of a second-tier city for a long time, and that's given us the opportunity to try some things because we weren't weighed down with having to kind of defend first-tier status. The other thing about Portland, and this is actually one of the kind of one of my favorite definitions of a region, is that you can look at a region any number of ways, but one of the most important ways is from the standpoint of what does it contribute to the whole, meaning that without the whole there would be no region, right? Well, this is a picture of the United States and its regions that was created back in the 1930s, which, you know, by some measures was not that long ago, although, you know, I suppose it's getting longer and longer ago. But the point being that when this was drawn, this was kind of the part of the nation's effort to lift itself out of the Depression and figure out, you know, kind of what the next step was, how to change the trends, how to, you know, kind of increase the wages and income of people in the country. And so the vision of the country was, of course, that all the ships came to the Atlantic coast. And that what you have in the Pacific Northwest, you know, are jumping fish, tall trees, snow-covered mountains, wheat, elk, you know, the usual things you'd find in a resource colony. And we were expected to kind of be a resource colony, but the thing that we're known for, actually, in many ways, is the spectacular beauty. And, you know, obviously the same can be said of Tacoma and the Puget Sound. When you look at Portland, the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that we're a land of small things. 5 acres is a big piece of property for us. 20 houses is a big number of houses for one of our home builders in a year. You know, we have a lot of small firms. The biggest private employer in the Portland metropolitan region We have about 1.1 million jobs in Portland, the Portland region right now. The biggest private sector employer is Intel with about 16,000 jobs, which is a shrimp compared to the big private sector employers in this region, or in the region to the north, depending on how you draw the line. But the point being that we are a land of small things. We have a very fine grain. We use the term city really loosely. Portland is a city of about 610,000 people, but in our metropolitan region, we have the city of Johnson City, which I'm sure none of you have ever visited, although I could be wrong about that. 450 hardy souls in a trailer park who incorporated, some number of years ago. And, under the law, it's a city, right? So we've got those two. But the point being that within Portland, the grain is pretty fine. You don't spend a whole lot of time in any one thing. You move around pretty quickly. The other thing about the Portland metropolitan region is that it's a planned place. We've been at planning for a long time. And I suppose, there's a lot of ways you could kind of look to where that legacy comes from. But, in the modern era, it was really this kind of battle that played out between these two figures standing on the I-beam, one of whom is Jane Jacobs, and her understanding of street life and communities and the intense importance of nurturing those relationships and not getting in the way of what people do best with other people. Cities are about mixing it up. Jane Jacobs famously said, cities are places where people need to be comfortable among strangers, because fundamentally within cities, you're always among strangers. That's kind of the point. And so the whole notion is that the value of being in a city is that you can mix it up, exchange ideas, come up with new things to say. The other guy on the beam, Robert Moses, who actually came to Portland in the 1940s to develop a plan, and that's the map up there in the corner. That's the highway system that would have been built. Highways on about 2.5-mile centers. And for almost 30 years, that was the driving force for planning in the Portland region. The city of Portland itself in the 1960s had a comprehensive land use plan that was all about converting the cells made up of all those intersecting freeways essentially into cul-de-sacs with a park at the center and a school and a church. It was this kind of Sim City approach to remaking the city. And there were a couple of problems with that view. We don't have to go into all those right now. But you got to understand that Portland was on this track to become essentially not unlike many of the places which are now really struggling under the weight of the expectations that came with this kind of thinking. But Portland has become an intentional place. It's been intentional, I suppose you could look at it historically for a long time, but really from the 1960s and 70s on, things really began to change. And I can talk more about that in the question and answer if you'd like. But that if you look at the way in which Portland and Oregon have created innovation, most of the innovations we've created are actually innovations of preservation. They were things that were done to maintain the best of what existed, the beauty of the roadsides, the access to the soils in the Willamette Valley, the nature of what these different eras of city building had produced and how it could be used at a new time by a new group of people. So fast forwarding to this century, actually this is from the 90s, the Region 2040 plan, and a regional plan developed by our regional government, the only directly elected regional government in the United States, and there's a whole story behind that. Today, within this metropolitan area, there are about 2.3 or 2.4 million people, about 1.1 million jobs, as I said. We're projecting growth of somewhere between 750,000 and 900,000 people over the next 25 years. So, the place is continuing to grow. But, we grow pretty slowly. If you look at our annual percentage rate of growth over the very long term, or even over recent decades, we grow like about 1.2% a year on average. We're not explosive in the way that California cities, for example, grew in the last century. What this plan does, though, is it doesn't replace any of the local plans. This is a complement to the local plans. It's really an urban structure plan. It talks about the big pieces. And let's see if this thing works. Yeah, okay. There's the bouncing ball. So there's a bunch of blobs on this map, which is an important point all in of itself, because if you look at a city comprehensive plan or a zoning map, it's by parcel. The lines are straight and sharp. You can tell where one zone or plan designation begins and another ends. This is kind of suitably vague, because really what we're talking about are essentially only 4 key ideas about how the region is organized. One, that we're organizing ourselves around those blobs on the map. Starting in the 1970s, the Portland region really began to exchange a vision of, and this is going to sound really kind of complicated, but don't worry about it. I mean, it's kind of jargony, but exchange a vision of mobility for one of accessibility, meaning that rather than saying we're going to build a region where you can go as fast as you can from point A to point B, you can move across the region and you can live in one place and work in another place and drive everywhere as quickly as you can, that we would essentially begin to try to create a region that was organized as much as possible to give people what they needed close to where they were. Access to what they needed rather than mobility to kind of travel great distances. And to a large degree, that's actually come to pass. Vehicle miles traveled per capita has declined in our region since 1996. And the other thing that's been going on is that the trips themselves have been getting shorter and shorter. As the modes split for things like walking, biking, transit have essentially been at least holding their own or increasing. The second thing is that these purple blobs on the map are knit together with a transportation system. Now, again, since about the 1970s, Portland region has been working on a transportation plan that is not anti-car, that is not about ending freeways as we know them, which is not about digging big trenches, to basically make people get out of their vehicles, but about offering choice, because in the United States and most other places, there's not a whole lot of choice. And so it's a transportation system that offers a range of choices. Third part of this is an urban growth boundary. And there's a whole other story about the urban growth boundary, but the only thing I want you to remember about it for now is that the urban growth boundary has a 20-year land supply. And the idea is not that, the next house can't find a place to go, but that actually what we're trying to do is intentionally be aware of how we're growing and where it's going to happen, who's going to pay for it, and when it's going to occur. And then finally, it's about green spaces, because again, one of the reasons people like living in our region is that they're close to nature and they want that close where they are. Now, there's a lot of myths and facts about Portland. There's a lot of bottoms-up work that's made all this happen. We got a lot of suburbs, because actually fundamentally it's about creating choice. It's not about eliminating choice. It's not about saying everybody has to live the same way. And believe me, if you want to live at the end of a cul-de-sac in a suburban location, we can help you. In fact, the good news is that those places have become really cheap. So you can actually pick up half a dozen if you want. Glad to show you where to go. Farmers are not just developers biding their time. They're actually engaged in farming, and we have the farm gate receipts to prove it. The automobile is doing just fine. We never set out to be a model, but to kind of be a better version, the best version of Portland that Portland could be, which is different than trying to be a better version of Seattle than Seattle could be. That's not what was in our minds. And the myth that you can't eat quality of life, well, as a matter of fact, you can eat quality of life. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that in the Q&A. A few lessons. Participation matters. Change has occurred because people talk to each other a lot, over and over again, more than they wanted to. And the essence of this participation is inclusion. It's more points of view than we had before. In the 70s, inclusion meant not just having white guys at the table, but having young white guys at the table. And that began to change. We began to get women at the table. We began to get other people showing up. And now the big issue for us is getting not just kind of white people at the table, but getting all people at the table. And it's a struggle, but it's the essence of kind of what's made all this stuff matter and happen. Second, it's about authenticity. You got to make your own success. You decide what that is and then go for it. Planning really does matter. We've made a difference with how we've planned, and it takes time. It takes a long time. We're talking about 40 or 50 years worth of concerted effort. Not degrees of separation either. We're talking one related to the other. And then finally, a place is never done, and in that spirit, make no mistake, we have a ton left to do. Housing, I'd love to talk about infill housing. More building permits are granted in the city of Portland now than in the rest of the region combined. And it's occurring through infill, and believe me, that's got neighborhoods a little uptight about how that's happening, because we did some things with the zoning back in the 80s when there was no growth, when we were losing population, to try and incent growth. And now the market has discovered those things, like on Transit Street, you can build housing, multifamily housing with no parking. Which, any developers here in the audience? Right, yeah, is parking expensive? Yeah, sure, it's a cost. And who pays that cost? The people who live in the housing. So it's, there's a lot of reasons to want to avoid paying housing, avoid having to build parking, and the developers have discovered that, in fact, the code makes that possible, and the neighbors are a little uptight about it. We could talk about that. The other thing I'll point to, because all these things are kind of on our list, is economic opportunity. And for us right now, we just completed a project for the Technology Association of Oregon, which essentially is concerned that the number one threat to their continued economic viability is the potential decline in quality of life and livability as the region grows, because they need the region to be a great place to get the great workers that they need to survive. So it's Portland in a nutshell. We'll have more time to talk in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I wish I had put in some historic slides, because Tacoma's population growth rate between the 90s and actually the 20 years between 75 and 95 was something like 1,000%. Of course, that was 1875 and 1895, but there you go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about density and where it is. And for those of you who, in the small print there, I have to do this because occasionally I get in trouble by saying something, and then people go back and say, wait a minute, is that a policy of the cities? And no, it's just the ramblings of Councilmember Bowe. So Tacoma in the 90s, now we're talking the 1990s, started putting together a plan for growth, and that was the mixed-use centers. Different colors, green being neighborhood mixed-use centers of small scale. A lot of time was spent. I was on the Planning Commission in 2005 when this was starting to be baked. And the yellow being the more community centers, larger scale buildings, a little more car oriented, and then our urban centers. We then took the downtown area and really focused on that a little bit more, and have done sub-area plans. This is relatively recent. Have scored really well on regional funding by doing that. I think this work here, when Sound Transit was putting together their link extension program to the feds, they really relied on a lot of the sub-area planning, and now we have $75 million earmarked in the president's budget for that. As we were going through the neighborhood mixed-use centers, this is pulled from the city's website. We were showing the vision of these larger buildings. The upper left there, that was showing what a building in Proctor could look like. Then, of course, someone comes along and says, "This is what we're going to do in Proctor," and all hell breaks loose because they're following the vision that was proposed for the neighborhood mixed-use centers. So it's one of those, I think Ethan was kind of commenting on it. Let's plan for the growth, but then when someone actually puts it together, it's, wait, we don't want that. And a lot of that, for me, is urban growth boundaries. I know you're all professionals out there, you know what an urban growth boundary is, but that whole plan of those mixed-use centers, and then providing incentives in those mixed-use centers through the property tax exemption to get development, kind of assumes that there is some containment on that. And I love this. I spent some time studying in London and their green belt, which was back in the 30s, and it really was about, well, we'll just put a fence basically around the cities, and so we can protect the rural and provide incentive for development within. So I love this little drawing from the 1930s, showing London and their whole concept of green belts. Kind of follows on some of the slides that Ethan had of keeping the little villages out in the perimeter, and then that's kind of what it looks like. We're going to really protect that, and Beckenham, which is just to the southeast there. My wife and I lived there for a year, and we felt we were in the country. We didn't feel like we were in Spanaway. We felt we were actually in the country. Portland did a great job. Ethan commented on that a little bit. And King County's done a reasonable job at that. You can see kind of the east, again, the east side there, and King County getting a little bit of leakage. So I did a little drawing there of Pierce County, and I hope you can get your bearings. Is it the red dot? So there's Tacoma and Puyallup and Lakewood, University Place, and JBLM. And I put in some markers here, 112th, 176th, 260th, 304th. And one would expect, if you looked at urban growth boundary, you'd have a map, something like that, getting a little bit of growth, even some of the outlying cities. But that's what we have. That's the county's urban growth. Goes out 15 miles from the center of Tacoma, and it is an area that is as big as Tacoma and Lakewood and University Place combined. Bonnie Lake doubles in size. So Aliyah didn't know I was going to touch on this a little bit, but that also is the growth rate. And this was a comment I heard at a meeting a year ago with great pride from the executive's office that, this is great. Highest population. So I have not used up all of my time, so I think we're back on schedule. I thought I had 7 minutes, but this is, so there you go, and I look forward to the questions.
I'm Cary Bozeman, and I was the former mayor of Bellevue in the 70s and 80s and 90s in Bremerton, and now I'm doing work in Aberdeen, Washington. So I've gone from the richest city in the state to the poorest to the really poorest. The next two speakers are not planners. I doubt Ron and I have read a set of plans in a long time. So you're not going to hear anything about planning. What we are here today is to talk about change. And there's three key elements for me in creating change in a community and making it better and moving it forward. First is leadership. Nothing good happens without leadership. Ron Sims was a great leader for King County, did a lot of great things. But communities need leadership at every level, whether it's a school district, a PTA, supervisor at the University of Washington, whatever it is. Good communities are made up of people who have the ability to lead. The second thing I'll touch on real quickly is something I'm writing a book on with a dear friend of mine now. That's the creation of innovative, creative projects. Nothing really gets done anymore unless people come together and form partnerships. No one in this environment has the resources or the funding, especially government, to do anything by themselves. So if you can't pull people together around an idea and a project, you won't get it done. And then third, I'll touch real quickly on Bellevue and what I went to Bellevue in 1970 to work for the boys. It was the Boys Club in those days. Now it's Boys and Girls Club. And was a member of the City Council for 16 years in the early stages of the creation of this very profitable economic community we know as Bellevue. So let me touch on leadership. Leadership's four elements of leadership. They're pretty much the same all the time. Leaders have a vision of what they want to do and where they want to take a project. These projects, as I look down today on the museum and the other two buildings down here, this building, this project, people led. People had a vision about what they wanted to do. The second is, if you might have a vision, but you need a plan. You need the discipline for that vision. You need to be able to go to, I've had 1 million people in my life come to me with this great idea, and then we start talking about the discipline of it or the plan of it, and it falls apart. So vision's only as good as the plan you put together. The third thing is being able to pull people together around that vision. And to do that, you have to be trusted. You have to be someone that your handshake works. So I remember one of the great visionaries in Seattle, and in the early days, Seattle was more of a private sector vision leadership community than it was public sector. But I remember a guy named Jim Ellis when Lake Washington, and Ron will remember this, you couldn't swim in Lake Washington anymore. It was so polluted. And a fellow named Jim Ellis came to this idea with some other people of putting together a metropolitan sewer district. And they put a ballot on the issue called Forward Thrust, led by Jim Ellis and a bunch of visionaries. And it passed, and it created the regional sewer district, cleaned up Lake Washington, and the rest is history. So they had a plan, but Jim Ellis was one of these kind of people. If Jim gave you his handshake and he told you he was going to do something, he did it. So he was able to bring people to him because they trusted him. They trusted him. So they trusted his vision. They knew he had a good plan because he was a disciplined person and he could be trusted. And the last element of creating change, because you know how to lead, is you have to have a passion for it. I worked 8 years on the Bellevue Downtown Park because I had this passion to get this thing done. I ran an extra term because we weren't quite finished, but I had it in my gut and my heart. So when I see change in a community, it's usually because there was good leadership, someone had a vision, someone had a good plan, someone was passionately involved with it, and someone was able to bring people together around that plan. So let me give you a couple examples of innovative projects I've worked on. In the city of Bremerton, we had an old, decaying city hall. It was really crummy. And our bonding capacity was very low. We could raise about $3 or $4 million by ourselves. And no one had built a new building in downtown Bremerton in a long time. All the retail had moved to Silverdale. The downtown had died, literally died. So government most times has to lead in a bad economy. They have to make the initial investment. Private sector is only going to come when they believe their investment's going to get a return. So government many times in decaying and economic downtime has to find a way to lead. So our vision was we were going to create this building in the middle of downtown. It was going to be the first Class A office space built, and we went and hired one of the best firms in Seattle to do the architectural work. And we came up with this idea. We had condominiumized the project with other government agencies. So we actually retained our housing authority to be our developer. And they got the authority through the Renewal Act, and we went to the state legislature for that. And so they were able to accumulate the other government agencies. So in the end, we got 6 other government agencies to agree to 20-year leases on this building. And so when they agreed to that, then we could get the financing. So we issued revenue bonds with the backing of the county, who had a AA bond rating. So with that, we got lower financing. So we got 6 agencies in one building, the health department, the county housing department, the city housing department, the city of Bremerton, the UW extension was in there, and the Norm Dick's office was in there. Never been done to my knowledge in the country, where you get 6 other government agencies to come in, sign on 20-year leases. Those 20-year leases get done, the building's paid off. It was a $46 million project, and it is a world-class building that we're all proud of. Could have never happened without 6 different government agencies coming together. The next project I'll talk a little bit about, because I think it's important to what's happening in Bellevue, was the opportunity we had to buy a big piece of land in downtown Bellevue. It would have been an old school site. It was right next to Bellevue Square, right in the middle of the heart. 20-acre site. And the school district came to us and they said, we had a joint meeting with the school district one night. And they said, we want to carve out, we're closing the school's closed, we're closing the administration building. We're going to give the city 5 acres so you can do a nice little park. And then we want you to rezone the 15 acres for commercial development. And we left that meeting that night and everybody's all excited. We're going to get free 5 acres and all this new commercial development would go on the tax base and would be great for the city right in the middle of downtown. And I went and had a beer with our park director, a guy named Lee Springate, who I think to this day was the most progressive, brightest, smartest park person in the country, still is, still a good friend of mine. And he said, Cary, you got one chance to do something really great here. You got to buy the whole piece of property. And I said, holy cow, what do you think that's worth? And this was in 1982. He said, I think it's worth $20 million. And I said, okay, that means they were going to give us $5 million piece of property, and you want us to turn that down and find the money to spend $20 million. He said, I do. He said, I think what that'll do, it'll generate housing in the middle of your downtown. It'll upgrade property values throughout the downtown. It will really create what Central Park did for New York. I mean, where do you find that? Where's the most expensive residential property in the world? It's next to Central Park. So this was going to be our Central Park. So anyway, he convinced me. I got 4 other votes on the council. We passed a 1/10 of 1% increase on our sales tax on a 20-year bond. We paid it off in 8, and then we went to develop the park. We did an international design competition. We came up with this little firm out of Milwaukee who came up with this wonderful design where there were no central activity features, only water and pasture and walking. And that was just what we wanted. So we put it on the ballot for development. It was $6 million. We needed 60%. We got 59.8. Broke my heart. It was the saddest night of my life. So half the council, who hadn't been in favor of this anyway, came and said, okay, Bozeman, we'll sell half, we'll sell 10 acres, and you'll still have 10 acres, which is going to be double what you had in the first place. I said, we can't do that. We've lost the big opportunity. So I went to John Ellis. Here's the partnership issue. Who was president of Puget Power, Jim's brother. So the Ellises were pretty powerful people. And he loved the park idea. I said, okay, here's what we'll do. Never been done before to my knowledge. We will lease you for $1 a year half the park. So 10-acre site, we'll lease it to you, and you create this nonprofit, and you raise $3 million, and you develop the first half of the park for us. And we'll give you 3 years to do it. He said, I'll do it. So he put together a group of people, 40 business people in the community. Everybody made a contribution. He raised $4 million. Wright Runstead was the developer on the project. We got half done. By then, the city was doing well. We were paying off the bonds. We went back and finished the rest, and the rest is history. The park is now surrounded by condominiums and apartments that are very expensive. It's created this public space in the middle of downtown that I think has really been the catalyst for what downtown Bellevue is today. But it was here we go again, government, private sector partnership that created this wonderful, wonderful facility. Just one other project that we did in Bremerton is kind of interesting. We couldn't attract private developer to do. We own waterfront in downtown Bremerton, but we couldn't find anybody to build housing. So we actually went back to our housing developer again, got them to build the high-end condominium sites for us. We're able to make a private bank loan and sold them all, and now they're all in private ownership. But we did that through government to begin with. So let me talk about Bellevue real quick, and I'm almost done here. What created Bellevue? Bellevue's a city of 125,000. It probably has one of the highest per capita incomes in the country, maybe, probably now. The downtown could actually service a population of 2 million. I don't know if you've been to Bellevue lately, but it's 2 million. So the keys to Bellevue were in the 70s, Bellevue had the best school district in the state, and still to this day probably still does. And what happened was, a lot of University of Washington graduates that work in downtown wanted to put their kids in a great school district. They were concerned. Busing had just started in Seattle. You know, there was some turmoil going on, and so they said, we want our kids in a great school district. So I really believe the Bellevue School District helped create Bellevue. Bellevue was a very progressive city council, and we believed in open space, and we believed in parkland. We were very aggressive in acquiring public open space. We had a very progressive staff, and we passed some of the first we passed a storm drainage utility. We passed the first Gross Management Act in the state of Washington. I think we passed the first steep slopes and drainage issues in the state, but we had a very progressive planning group. We developed the most restrictive sign code in the state. no freestanding signs. We made everybody take down any freestanding sign. We gave them 5 years to amortize the signs, and they all came down. So if you wanted a sign in downtown Bellevue, it had to be attached to the building, and it had to meet the code. Very restrictive. Everybody complained, everybody bitched, people threatened to sue us, and now they all love it. It was a big part of what we do. We developed design review process. We required quality landscaping standards on all our buildings, et cetera, et cetera. The things we missed, we didn't buy enough waterfront in our community. We had this opportunity back in the 70s to acquire a lot more on Lake Washington, and now the city's going back and paying millions for these homes that are on Lake Washington so they can connect the downtown park to the waterfront. And it's going to be fabulous. We built a convention center, which has been, I think, pretty successful. The last thing I'll talk about is retail in the Bellevue Square. Back in the 70s, people were threatening Bellevue. DeBartolo was in here from Cleveland. He was going to build a South Center Mall equivalent between Bellevue and Redmond. And we really worked hard, and we knew that would kill our downtown retail sector. So we really worked hard with Kemper Freeman of Bellevue Square to get him to move ahead with a redevelopment of Bellevue Square. And he did. And it discouraged all the outside development that's happened to so many cities where the retail moves outside to some big mall. And our mall was right downtown. And he redeveloped it, he's still redeveloping. And so we retained this high-end retail center in the middle of our downtown. And now we have residential. They're building new condominiums every day. And the last element I'll add is a little company called Microsoft. And I remembered the day Microsoft came to Bellevue to look for property. And there was a very young-looking guy that wore a sweater like this, and he approached a very good friend of mine named Joe Lynch, who's now passed on, and he said, "I want to lease 50,000 square feet from you." And the guy looked like he was about 15, and the guy was Bill Gates, obviously. And my friend Joe said, "Yeah, sure you do, Rob." And so he did, and the rest is history. And then I remember one day getting a call from him when I was mayor, and Joe was on the phone. He said, "Cary, you gotta come. Microsoft's moving to Redmond. Microsoft's moving to Redmond. Oh my God." And so I run down to a meeting, and they had already decided they wanted a campus. And we didn't really have a piece of ground that would meet their needs. But the good news is they found their campus. They're leasing probably 50% of downtown Bellevue buildings comes from Microsoft. And that really was the last thing. And now, and I want to make one last, back in the 80s, we started to notice Bellevue was becoming more diverse. And we paid attention to it. And I used to give speeches to the chamber that the chamber wasn't diverse enough. We didn't have enough people of color. We didn't have enough people from other countries, and that was going to be the economic development opportunity for any city in this country. So we developed a cultural diversity task force, and we found out that we were really becoming much more diverse in our community. And I remember talking to a firm, I think it was a Japanese firm, and they were looking for, they were going to bring 800 employees, and they were looking wherever they were going to light. And they finally made the decision they weren't going to come to Bellevue. And this was back in about mid-80s. And they said, "We just don't believe culturally you're ready for us." And boy, that was a big lesson, and it should be a lesson to everybody. I mean, we're in an international, global economy. And these communities that, the biggest real estate market in Bellevue right now is from China. And it's driving the cost of housing up, which is bad news. I mean, in West Bellevue right now, the average cost of housing is $1.2 million. That's ridiculous. I mean, that's off the chart. But people coming from China and buying homes, and they want to settle there for good schools and all those kind of things. So all those elements had a lot to do with the creation of this place we call Bellevue now. So I was quick. I didn't have enough time, but I enjoyed being here. Leadership and doing things cooperatively through partnerships and create innovative, great partnerships are what really move communities along. Thank you.
Cary said it all, so I can go sit down now. It's an honor to be here. It's nice knowing that there's a number of other people who couldn't tell Dr. Modera's notes. So, and I enjoyed the presentation you made this morning. Very, very thoughtful and provoking. I want to give you kind of a perspective that the federal government had, and a little bit of what King County also had. But I want to say there were two people who I thought were seminal in King County, though, for two different reasons. One is that, as Cary said, you can't say enough about one single person, that was Jim Ellis. Because Jim Ellis made a decision that we should be a region. We should not be just a Seattle, or we shouldn't be just an East Side, that we need to function as a region. And so what he created was a brand new government, which was the metro government. And he did it in two different ways. One, all wastewater was collected and treated under King County, under Metro. And then he also created a bus system, because it was really, really important at that time when nobody else was liking buses. He was thinking about trains too. Nobody liked them either. But at that time, and he also had forward thrust, but he was saying the region had to benefit. There was a lawsuit brought years later by the ACLU, which forced King County, as the judge would say, for King County and Metro to merge. And so you had what we call a county government being merged with a metropolitan government, which required King County not to think as a county government anymore, but to think as a regional government, an incredible benefit because of one man's persistence, Jim Ellis. The other was Norm Rice, largest city in the area. Norm Rice made a decision that he called them urban villages, and everybody said, oh no, not my neighborhood. And Norm said, we're going to have urban villages, and we're going to tear down all of the single room occupancy housing downtown, and we're going to concentrate people more in buildings where we would provide services if they were homeless, but downtown would change. And people said, no, you're going to change the character of downtown. So Norm said, no, I'm going to persist, and he prevailed. And as a result, Seattle downtown became attractive. I remember an article in the newspaper that said Seattle, I think I.A. Magnin had left, Woolworths had left, and people said Seattle is being closed after 5 o'clock. It was always closed after 5 o'clock. But Norm's vision was, why don't we go back and feed the beast to those stores that would stay, and also introduce all kinds of other features. Arts in particular came in, restoration of the market, but he made downtown viable. But I want to say, when I went back to Washington, D.C., what did we see in Washington, D.C. that we liked? And it was interesting. The first thing we found out is that USDOT, EPA, and HUD always fought each other. We had mastered it and perfected it. EPA had a Brownsfield program, HUD had two. We would talk about the fact that HUD could move independently, and we would do that independent of what USDOT desired, whether it was going to be on their highways, whether it was going to be on their, especially on their public transportation systems. So the three deputy secretaries all agreed that we were going to harmonize our efforts. We were called and I can never forget one description that we described. We were all friends before we came to Washington, D.C. And I remember talking to John Cary, and I said, John, I hope that we can work together and be collaborative. He said, no, we won't. So I said, John, I hope that we can be cooperative. And John says, no, we won't. And I said, John, I would hope that we would have mutual interest. And he says, no, we won't. Now, this is a person I've known for a long time, so I'm totally perplexed. But he says, but being intimate co-conspirators works really well, which is what we did. And so as a result, EPA and HUD and U.S. Department of Transportation began to say that regions were going to be more important. That the idea of talking about cities and the viability of cities wasn't going to work. We didn't want any part of a region to fail, but we thought regional growth had to occur and be strong and viable. So we moved forward with a series of collaborative processes within our budgets that said that we would grade out regions in regards to the funding they were going to receive based upon whether or not it was a city application or a regional one, or whether the city could explain its benefit to the region, or the region could explain its benefit to the cities inside it. But the idea was to move away from what we call the kinds of structural inefficiencies that we saw in regions throughout the United States. As a result of that, Congress was very kind and put money in 3 of our budgets, our HUD's budget, and that was more of a planning grant where we would allow to come out with planning grants from $5 million down to $1 million. This region got a $5 million grant through the PSRC, and I'll tell you why that happened. And then when we ran out of money with our grants, then USDOT would come in with money asking to do the same thing. And when they ran out of money, EPA came in with grants, again asking for regional planning. That policy has not changed at all. And the demographics will show why it hasn't changed. You just simply cannot anymore talk about a city's health. You have to talk about a region's health. But there's a look and feel in a region. Let me tell you what those look and feels were in our view. One of the things that the business community said in King County, the Microsoft and other tech companies, but also nationally when we had our meetings with them, is look and feel is very important. Look and feel is very important. And how do you attract people when you have look and feel? Well, they said, people want to feel comfortable in a community. So people say, well, that means you're not going to have any densities. And they said, oh, excuse us, no, densities have never been a problem. Look and feel is not whether you have densities or not. Matter of fact, the absence of densities actually can curtail look and feel. The issue was, do you have strong arts features? Arts. So we looked at regions that had strong arts. They said, what are the things to look for? Well, King County had come out with a policy of being able to predict by zip codes life outcomes. So we imposed that in EPA and in USDOT and in HUD, saying that we would look for communities where we thought there was an effort or a capacity to address zip codes, because zip codes, as a matter of fact, our mantra was that zip codes should not be a life determinant, they would become an address only. Because in all of the United States, we were showing all kinds of charts talking about that the lifetime earnings of children can be determined by zip code. People said those are areas that are poverty. We said, no, those are areas of neglect. And anybody that came to us and said that we're not going to address those areas, we said, fine, then you won't get any of our money, because we have no interest in people saying that they're going to be winners and losers within a community, whether they're in small cities, large cities. We also said that we wanted the business community's inclusion in decisions, because sometimes the business community would see itself apart from it. We didn't want any lords of the land, as we called it. Everybody had to be on equal footing, so that whether you were elected officials, whether you were business community, whether you were nonprofits, you all had to be at the same table, resolving what we call the vision of your region. We also had one thing, though, that we really loved, but it was our secret, and we never ever kind of enunciated it. We hinted. In our criteria, we said, what is your relationship with universities? Now, we didn't mandate that you have a relationship with the university, because some places said to us, well, our university, we already have one. And we said, no, we just are curious. We can tell you that the shallowest areas of recession in the United States were places that had universities. Very, very clear. The places that recovered most quickly are places that had universities. So our issue was, where there were people, we were not going to deal with a region that did not understand the consequence of having a university in it. And so we had people apply for grants, and there was no university listed, and they didn't get any money. And they came to us to appeal, and we said, well, they said, you didn't list the university. He said, that wasn't required. We said, no, it was to us an issue of common sense. You cannot, in the United States of America or any other place in the world, ever grow out independent of a strong university systems. The more robust they are, the more attractive they become. It's a signal both to the private sector in regards to development purposes. It's also what we call look and feel. People like being around a place where they believe that there's a university influence. Matter of fact, one of the interesting things is, why does Ellensburg, Washington work? Because they got Central Washington. Why would you live in Ellensburg? But you go over there. I went to Central Washington, so I can say that. So you go over to Central Washington, and you see the fact that a lot of people now are saying, well, 3 days over there, technology allows us to do our work in Seattle. But that is true at Eugene, Oregon. It is true at other places where we're beginning to find communities where all of a sudden you're saying, why are they growing? And it's because they have strong universities. Walla Walla, you don't go down there just for the fact that it has wonderful wineries. Walla Walla has always had Whitman College, which has infected the place with a certain look and feel. You cannot today ever talk about regional function at all, at any kind, without having a university. North Dakota. There's an area of North Dakota that we actually didn't go into recession, which stunned us. But that's where the University of North Dakota was. Now, that's probably simple. They were the only employer. But nonetheless, It worked for University of North Dakota. You look at Denver, at Colorado, and places, various places in Colorado. You look at the places that have quickly recovered in California. All of them have universities. So we tell people that we downplay universities. In this state, we're having a debate about whether universities should be funded. My argument is that no, you don't fund universities. You give them enough money to grow. It's just beyond just whether or not it is funding. It is whether or not you have material growth on university education, because that's what employers want. The other, and the reason why it's a common rule, I think all of us who have been in elected positions and have had leadership positions realize that I love what Cary was talking about, how do you define a leader? I always define a leader as, a leader knows one thing: you get out of the way of smart people. And you allow for environments of risk. He talked about all the risks they took, but remember, Cary created a risk environment, where all of a sudden, if you made a mistake, we said, oh, okay, we'll roll with it. Because smart people know how to calibrate their risk, and we know sometimes they're going to succeed and sometimes they're going to fail. So we looked at the problems facing King County when I was the King County executive, and that translated into HUD's policies as well. People said to us, what did Bill Gates tell you in the meeting that he wanted in order to expand? And he wanted to expand, but he had a big debate. He was under incredible pressure to move a number of his services. Israel had a very, very long, in fact, in Haifa, has a very big campus, Microsoft campus. And they wanted to do more, not less. So how do you compete against Haifa? A beautiful, trust me, beautiful place in the Eastern Mediterranean. Wonderful, sandy beach, great food, unbelievable views. How do you compete against Haifa? So I asked him, how do we compete? And he said simply, if in fact you're not going to adhere to the Growth Management Act, we're gone. He said, you know, what our people, when they fly in and we're trying to recruit them, what they say to us? It's really green. And so we ended up with a very, very intensive green mantra, which is, we had all this land. I remember meeting with the builders. I said to the builders, if you go east of the land of the Growth Management Act, not only will the environmentalists pounce on you, but I will as well. So you'll be in litigation forever, and I'm not going to move the line. It will not be moved. But if you want to build west of the line, I won't say a word. And I have negotiated with the environmental community that they won't sue you for creating density. And we had a meeting where both sides came in and shook their hands, and our agreement was no litigation outside of the growth management line unless you wanted to build there, and no litigation inside the line if you were building. We wanted densities. The other issue, though, was what happens when you're gone. And I remember actually telling my staff, you know, I don't want to do this job forever. You know, I may win the lottery and just go someplace on a beach, enjoy myself, stick my feet in warm water, and if that my sons can go to school, they can pay for it, but it's going to happen. And so I said, so what happens when I'm gone? Because a policy with what happens when you're gone? And so I had staff say, well, why don't we buy up all that land? And I said, that is a good idea. So I gave a speech in Vancouver, Canada. And I said King County was going to buy 100,000 acres. So I came back and my staff said, where are we going to get the money? I said, you're all smart, you'll figure it out. But we're going to buy 100,000 acres. And we hired the Trust for Public Lands and said to us what we should buy first, both for visual purposes, but also for environmental function, the protections of habitat, streams, wetlands. We wanted to make sure that we controlled that land. In the end, we bought 197,000 acres. There were a variety of tools. None of them we had REIT 1, 2, and 3, which allowed us to build parks and greenways and control those. But we used transfer development rights, conservation rights. We use our wastewater funds and bonds because we knew how to grow trees, and we tell people we'll grow your trees faster if you let us control your land, which is how we got Hancock's 93,000 acres. So all those things allowed us to create an area that looked like it was livable and had a high quality of life. Remember I told you, look and feel. But it required partnership between the business community, the finance community, and government. It required people with vision like Norm Rice and Jim Ellis to say how we're going to go ahead. It required talented staff who are willing to take risks, not sit on their seats and say, oh, nothing, what happens if I fail? I just tell people, look, if you succeed, I'll sing your praise. If you take a risk and you succeed, I'll sing your praises to the end of the world. If you take a risk and you fail, I'll applaud you to the end of the world. If you take no risk at all, I'll make it the most miserable workday you ever had. And the idea is that's what leaders do and are confident on. I want to close with this one point. There was a group of us that sat on the national, worked with the President's Council of, we call CEQ, Council of Environmental Quality, Jane Lachenko and Nancy Sutley. We developed a model that would predict who would be winners and losers all around the world on global warming. Who would win and who would lose. And we had a big fight with all the people who had satellites because they wanted to say, they had a debate on their imagery and their chemistry. And I used to say, we're debating how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin. Can you all go back and come back and agree that what we're seeing is what we're seeing? And they did. This region, from Portland to Vancouver, will be the biggest winner in an age of global warming, and the entire state will be, as will Oregon. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to avoid climate change. It simply means that we have fewer challenges because of climate change than any other place in the world. So what does it mean already? And we've seen signs of it. From Portland to Vancouver, King County metropolitan area will actually add, along with Snohomish and Pierce County, one congressional district every 10 years. But when we looked at its projections to 2100, we are going to have about 600,000 new people in this region. The most enormous growth. And they're not going to just be young people, because older people will go away in the winter to avoid the clouds, but they come back here in the summer. Really unprecedented, because in Boston and Minneapolis and other places, they leave. So here people are staying for whatever reasons. But what does that mean to us? It means that the transportation system remains as it is today. Somebody else's, I would take advantage of it. If I were Tacoma, I would say, why would you want to take 45 minutes to get up to Seattle when you can have a company down here and you can have your employees nearby? But it requires you to have an efficient, strong, not a roadway system, but a really strong public transportation system. Really, really strong. It requires you to have the look and feel, parks, playgrounds, preservation. It requires you not to allow disparities. Not to have zip codes that are not functional, because those become sores and they become problems and they draw down literally the capacity of your community to move forward aggressively and get anything done. So if you do it right and smart, Tacoma and Pierce County you would have to really work hard to fail, not to benefit this century. But if you're smart, if you're really smart, and you're addressing many of the issues that Professor Medeiros raised this morning in regards to here are the things that you need to adjust, you tackle them. Because I look at the data and said, he is so correct. He is so correct. He is so correct. If you are really smart and take that data and say that's going to be our roadmap to our future, Tacoma now will not be the Tacoma of the Tacoma, or Pierce County now. Tacoma and Pierce County will not be the Tacoma and Pierce County of today. It will not look like that when my granddaughter has decided to have children, which better be a long way from now. But nonetheless, the window is really, really small, because we also realize in the age of global warming that there's going to be winners and losers. And if you don't care, nobody else will. If you don't want it, somebody else will want it. So the capacity of growth, modernization, arriving at, I think, efficient economies, having a diverse workforce, having schools that work. Well, if you alter your look and feel, and you just go after it, it's yours, because people are going to want to live here. You cannot have 600,000 new people in the metropolitan area and have somebody not say, it's really, transportation sucks. I want to live near schools. I want to live near where I work. I want to live near where I shop. The one also advantage, and the Bay Area is capitalized on it as well, you got institutions that require smart people, but they're mobile. They are very mobile. If they can't find their job base, if they can't find their employees here, they move. Austin, Texas. I'll never forget. This will be my last comment. We're down for 3 days. 3 deputy secretaries are in Austin, Texas for 3 days, and they're wining us and dining us. They have a grant, our grant for regional planning. They have UT Texas Austin there, who's also well there, and they're pointing out that they have the world's fastest computer at that time. Now it's the 3rd fastest computer at that time, but they allow their private sector access to that computer for the development. Facebook's down there, Microsoft's down there, Google's down there, Apple, everybody's want that computer. So they're just smiling, saying, you're from Seattle. That's why I will call you the Seattle exec. I said, no, I'm actually Deputy Secretary for the United States of HUD. Yeah, but you're a Seattle exec. And they have made a decision that there's 2 places that they have to excel, to compete with. One is Silicon Valley, and the other is not Boston. It's not North Carolina. It's this region. And they are putting in the infrastructure that is smart, the housing that is smart, the systems that are smart, wrapping it around an educational system that is smart, because they have found look and feel, regional planning, and having all parties there. And they want to be a destination point. They don't want to be the oil capital of the world. They like clean air down there. Now they're in a drought. And so what are they working on? Water preservation and restoration, a huge, huge project, and they're going to be smart about it. So we have people that have looked at this region and said, if they are inept, we will welcome them in our community. So this is going to be an incredible time of great opportunity, great opportunity. It's going to be exciting as heck, but if you stand, you can either choose to evolve, or you can be the mastodons of our time.
Okay, we're going to open up to the floor. The first question is always hardest. I will take a moment to note some common themes from our first to our last speakers, where Ethan opened up talking about an abundant region, and Ron Sims talking about, and fine grain, Ron Sims talking about livabilities, and a regional perspective, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of issues here. The first question always gets things started. We have about half an hour, and so what I would ask you to do, where's the microphone? Right here. There's a microphone right there, a microphone right there. You go there so the rest of the room can hear your question, and that if you want to direct it either to the group or a particular person you want it, you can go ahead and I'll sit down, and then you can run yourselves. So we have a first question, concern, disagreement, outrage, clarification. There we go.
Good morning. Thank you all for doing it, but I have a question for Dr. Seltzer. In your presentation, you spoke about the concept of regional planning in the Portland area as it related to the plans of the individual communities in the metropolitan area, and your phrasing was that the regional plan was viewed as being complementary to them, which I inferred meaning as opposed to being directive to them. And you're being a Portland person, do the smaller communities think that's reality there? And maybe then to the rest of the panel, is that the way we're looking at regional planning here?
Good question. So a couple of things. We would not have had that plan had it not been for a previous effort to engage all the jurisdictions in the region. So kind of full disclosure, I was working for the regional government on this, and we had spent 2 years working with suburban mayors, county executives, citizens on a set of regional urban growth goals and objectives. And it was then, my champions at that point were the mayor of Gresham, the Washington County Executive, which is to the west of Portland, and the Clackamas County Executive, which is to the south and the east of Portland and Multnomah County. The three of them concluded that we had all the ingredients, but we had no vision, and we needed to have a vision. So they were the ones who went to the Metro Council and said, we need to take the next step. We need to put this together into a broader vision that explains where we're going. We would not have been there had it not been for the participation leading up to that point, where people could put their concerns on the table, where they could kind of work things out. I think in the end what we found was that we were speaking to issues that everybody was concerned about, but that nobody had named quite accurately enough. And so it gave people a point of reference to kind of come together around. Now, the way that the land use planning program works in Oregon is that every city and county has to have a comprehensive land use plan, but only cities and counties can create comprehensive land use plans. So Metro can't create a comprehensive land use plan, but it can identify regional issues to which local communities can be held accountable. So there is a very strong kind of accountability link there, but not through creating a regional comprehensive plan. So Metro had to kind of focus its efforts down to the things which were really regional in nature. Are there jurisdictions that chafe at any kind of outside intervention in their view of who they are and where they're going? Of course. I mean, it's America after all, right? And we delegated the powers to basically have control over land use to the smallest jurisdictions, Johnson City, years ago. And we're not going to put that horse back in the barn. But I think, it's really a process of, in a funny kind of way, inclusion, participation, and helping people to kind of identify what they share in common, and then reminding them over and over again that if they value what they share, they actually have to pay attention to what's happening to it. So the short answer to your question is, yeah, of course people chafe at this, but it kind of comes and goes. At the end of the day, the most important thing we can do is to ensure that there is some kind of touchstone that kind of works across a majority of the jurisdictions at any point in time. It's not about making everybody happy. It's kind of like a family, right? No one gets the same, everyone gets what they need. That's kind of what you got to kind of keep your attention on.
Yeah.
I have the pleasure to serve on the Puget Sound Regional Council Transportation Policy Board. It's a mouthful, I know. I find it, I don't know if it's bemused or frustrating. I haven't determined. I guess it goes a little bit in and out. Because when you look at that regional goals, they seem very clear. And that's why I did the little Wikipedia on urban growth boundaries, because you're reading the regional plan, and it is really clear. And then I also serve on the Pierce County Regional Council, and they don't seem to be on the same page. And that's a challenge to say, and I don't see the representation at Puget Sound Regional Council of strong Pierce County contingent. I mean, it's heavily Kitsap, King County, as far as active, participation. So that may be part of the issue as well. But they're definitely, you said chafing, at a minimum a chafing between the smaller cities. Because to me, if you're really following these bigger plans, they aren't necessarily fair in the sense of we'll be giving everyone everything equitably. It's more to say, no, there's a line, and this has a different set of goals, and this is a different set of goals, but sometimes people want them all to be the same. Spread the peanut butter thinly over the whole county.
Can I exercise my, I want to follow up with both of you, and then if there's another question brewing, please go to. There's two differences, big differences that come to mind between our region and Portland. One is you're built around Portland. You don't have a second city like Tacoma right on your heels. So it creates, our situation is different because then Pierce County has performed this role of housing this hot market in the north for decades now. So that raises the second question. The obvious institutional difference is a very strong regional authority that was just an average MPO in the 60s, and they decided to empower. All of the speakers spoke about regional collaborations, but I think they mean maybe different things by it. Cary, you talked about working with the county housing authority in a partnership around a project, so that was necessary to get the project bonded properly so you could finance it. You talked, David, about the relationship between the city and the county, and then a sort of a city-county regionalism. And then the federal government's interested in thinking about the form and function of entire metropolitan region economies. And I wonder if we've thought enough about regional collaboration at all those scales. But is it, if you didn't have Metro, could you have achieved the livability, the fine grain, and the fair share housing and the transit? How important is it? And in the absence of an institution like that here, we have an MPO. Maybe we should be funding more funds from the state DOTs to the MPOs, right? But that comes to mind. But we have an MPO. It's pretty good, but it's not Metro. So what do we do?
Right. Well, there are a lot of things that happened in parallel. There's no silver bullet in this game, and so if you kind of look at all the things that kind of have gone into the way that the Portland region has evolved from a governance point of view, a regional governance point of view. I mean, the 1972 downtown plan in the city of Portland was hugely important. The cancellation of the Mount Hood Freeway and the transfer of those funds into a regional pool that then got allocated by the MPO was hugely important, because I got to tell you, put money on the table, and give people the authority to kind of divide it up and hand it out to projects, and you've got people's attention. It works actually pretty well. So all these things kind of, came into play. The statewide planning program, all these things were kind of happening in parallel. And yeah, I think the thing that's made the regional government really important is because it does have some tools for accountability. Now, politically, the regional government can't use those tools very often, right? Because what the voters give, the voters can take away. And I think the regional government is sensitive to the fact that they just can't be out there, swinging away without contemplating the opposition that could grow from not just one jurisdiction that was kind of aggrieved, but maybe several kind of ganging up and trying to kind of change things. So Metro's got to enlist as much as it's got to kind of control. And it's that finding that sweet spot that we're still kind of in the process of doing. But I think, Yonn, you've got a really good point, which is that there are real mechanisms for accountability that you don't find in most places. And it kind of becomes a question of, well, what are people willing to be held accountable to? And I guess that's where I would start if I was having the conversation here about the nature of kind of regional governance. Is it a question of copying somebody else's form of government, or is it really more about determining what it is that will keep people at the table because they truly understand that they share the consequences of what might happen to those things over time? And I think it's the latter, not the former.
But your plans dictate what you're going to become.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when you say if there is a disconnect between the regional transportation plan and a local one, then the local one prevails. But remember, what I keep telling you is that if the reason why you want a regional one that works really, really well, it allows you, whether you want to work from in Everett all the way down to Pierce County, because the region is going to choke on its transportation system. This is not the most efficient system of transport. It used to be you could just drive in a snap. Now everybody, don't have an accident on I-5, Lord, please. And systems can't function very well under that. And that's why I keep talking about that. If I'm an employer, sooner or later, I'm just going to make a decision to go where I can get reliable systems of transportation, really good schools, and get my employees to and from my workplace fairly easily. And so there are going to be definitive winners and losers, and I think the people whose plans are disconnected from a regional one will be the people who lose. They won't attract they simply have will not help put the infrastructure in order to compete. Maybe that's the way that
Right.
I think. Yeah.
And here's the thing we're noticing now is that, we've got, the major tech corridor in Portland is to the west in Washington County. Nike is in Washington County, but a lot of the highest paid Nike and Intel employees don't want to live out there. They're living in the city. They're not just living in downtown, they're living on the other side of downtown, on some of the east side neighborhoods.
The state's in the middle of building their light rail public transportation system, and this question is directed to all four of you. So is there any advice you would give cities who want these hubs in their communities? And what do you think cities need to do to make light rail or any other form of public transportation successful?
The speaker is a planner in Fife.
Sorry.
You build a lot of housing around your light rail system, and it's particularly in your hubs. But you just build a lot of housing around them. And then light rail is not your ultimate answer. It is to be integrated with public transportation like buses. So people say, I want light rail, but I don't want buses. Excuse me. You feed your light rail hubs by buses. Creates incredible efficiencies. But if you go to Europe, it's far easier to see it than here, because we still believe that you should have a light rail station to stop every 3 blocks. That's really, really inefficient for light rail. It doesn't work well that way. And then you grow out your housing and your land use plannings based upon transit access to your light rail, and then your light rail takes you to the employment hubs. I think that's the way I would describe it.
Yeah, and I would say, beware park and rides. They're kind of like the freeways of the 21st century. In other words, the idea is, park and rides, they'll bring all these people into our city, and blah, blah, blah. Well, actually what they'll do is people will drive in, then they'll ride, and then they'll drive out. And all you're going to get is the traffic and the parking lots. And that what you really need to be doing, I think Ron is absolutely right, it's about housing. And it's about, kind of thinking about creating not just a spot, but a set of interconnected places that people can inhabit as pedestrians. So for example, in the Portland region right now, we're having a regional conversation about active transportation. Active transportation is the term of art these days for, bicycle and pedestrian kind of movement. And so some would say, well, bicycle and pedestrian movement at the scale of the region, isn't that an oxymoron, right? How does that work? Who's going to ride from one end of the region to the other? And the point isn't so much that people will ever ride from one end to the region to the other or walk that distance, but that as pedestrians, they can use the transit system to get around without necessarily depending on a car for all things, and that they've got that choice, that can work. And the stationaries need to be envisioned as an important element of that kind of network. But I think Ron's absolutely right. You gotta build the housing. You gotta create the local demand for services and restaurants and shops and activity and all the rest.
And it seems to me Tacoma is just sitting in a really good place right now, because what's happening in Seattle, and my daughter she leases apartments in Seattle. The average cost is $2.50 to $3 a square foot. So if you have 1,000 square foot apartment, you're spending $3,000 a month. And, incomes are high and yada, yada, yada. But if you're working at something where you're not making 80 to 100 or up, you can't afford to live down there. So Bellevue's the same way. So what happens is that now these people are forced, as we all know, it started with Federal Way and Everett and all that, to get on these freeways, which used to be okay. You could get back and forth. They're not okay anymore. They're actually obscene, right? So what better opportunity than Tacoma has to be the alternative option to some of these companies and people who want to live at least reasonably close to where they work at a price that's affordable. And that seems to me the real opportunity you have here, because that's not true in King County anymore.
And I would just say that when Dr. Medeiros was a true newcomer to this region, there was a discussion we had quite quickly about light rail and transportation, especially light rail systems. Are they like Tacoma Dome. It's a Tacoma Dome, a multimodal area, center of origin or destination. And when you think of them as origin, they're your park and rides where you come in and you park and you get into the system, and that's where you're starting the system because you're going somewhere else. Where destination is where you're going and arriving. Well, over 60% of the people who park at the Tacoma Dome get on some sort of transportation to go north. So we have basically a Tacoma Dome multimodal system that is acting as a origin center, and then you get exactly what you have. You're not getting off the train and saying, well, I think I'll hang out here and have dinner and all the rest of it. No, I'm going to get in my car, and I'm going to drive to Costco and pick up dinner, and then I'm going to go home. So I think that has to be really important. And it's been proven again and again and again, light rail is not a game changer on its own. The Urban Land Institute did a study of Hilltop, and the one thing they said is, don't fall in love with light rail as being the answer to your rejuvenation, renaissance, whatever. And so that was really loud and clear. And then the decision was made politically to run the light rail up to Hilltop because that's what will be the game changer. So,
Got to put density around it. The one elephant in the room we haven't talked about this morning, and I'll be really blunt on it. The only reason why you haven't seen a federal package on transportation funding come out is because all the underlying documents of the federal package entail having tolls on state I-5s. And once people see that toll and they get hit with it on a monthly basis, trust me, there better be some sites that want to receive both employment and housing. The federal package will deal with rural areas. But already, every state, everybody who's privy to those packages knows that there's going to be significant tolls because gas tax doesn't work on freeways. I got a Prius. My son subsidized me because he has a Highlander. But technologies are changing, and the only way you're going to get money for roadways is going to be on tolls, and it is coming fast, and it's going to be expensive, and that will alter pocketbooks. That should change some land use policies.
We have time, unfortunately. See, this is getting really good now. We have more panels. So we have one more question. We can never talk about jobs and housing without talking about transportation.
Thank you very much.
Really
I'd like to thank the panel for their excellent presentations, and especially Mr. Sims for that nice pep talk that he gave to us. I've been planning here in Pierce County since the 1990s and went through the early stages of GMA and the creation of the urban growth boundary here, which is quite large, as it was pointed out by Councilmember Bowe. But as you had indicated as well, there's been a lot of contentious behavior at the different levels of government and between the different counties for the limited resources. And we know that density for a lot of people is a four-letter word. For a lot of communities, as well as affordable housing. How do we convince our leaders to work together rather than so separately as it seems to be in this part of the region?
10 seconds each on that one.
Yeah, it's really difficult because everyone has their own self-interest. I remember back, and this is how old I am, but we created this regional body called King County 2000. And Wes Ullman, who had been the mayor, and I were the chair of that thing. And we were going to try to figure out how we could really create a list of priorities, infrastructure-wise, that would benefit the whole region. And we'd prioritize how we were going to spend the region's precious resources. We worked a year on the project. We had a list of those things we would have had light rail in 20 years ago. And the 520 bridge would have been at the top of the list too. But it fell apart at the end because no one wanted to be the first to say, okay, we're willing to make the sacrifices for the good of the whole. So that's it requires incredible leadership.
Time is a thief. Let me thank our panelists once again, and thank you for the questions. And if you have a question, we can push into the next panel, keynote, other panels as well. So thank you again.